You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios.
Everybody, I would say, in 1750 knew what time it was, and they needed to know what time it was. Timekeeping already for 100 years before that was becoming tyrannical almost in Western civilization. People couldn't eat when they were hungry. They had to eat when the clock said 12 o'clock. They couldn't wake up when the rooster crowed. They had to wake up when the clock rang 6 o'clock or 5 o'clock. So everyone was tuned into what time it was. The most accurate timekeepers were sundials because they aren't wrong, where clocks and watches can easily be wrong.
Hello, and welcome to episode 402 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. Do you know what time it is? In early America, this question wasn't as simple to answer as it is today. Urban dwellers in cities like Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston often wondered about the time, but few owned watches or clocks. So, how did early Americans keep track of the hours? In this episode, we're diving into the fascinating world of early American timekeeping. Bob Frischman, an horologist, a specialist in clocks and watches, joins us to explore how timepieces and their makers shaped community life and craftsmanship in the 18th century. Along the way, we'll uncover the remarkable story of Edward Duffield, a Philadelphia clockmaker who wasn't just a master craftsman, but he was also a close friend and neighbor of Benjamin Franklin. Now, during our investigation, Bob reveals information about early Americans' interest and obsession with keeping time, the work and place of early American clock and watchmakers in early American society, and what Edward Duffield's life and work reveal about the American Revolution in Philadelphia. But first, it's an exciting day because I'm introducing a new segment in this episode. It's called 1776 in Context. It's a segment about how the ideas, topics, and people we're investigating can help us better understand and appreciate the American Revolution. Now, this new segment came about because you took a survey last year, and I learned that you either love the Time Warp segment or you hate it, and there wasn't a lot of in between. But it turns out if you really disliked the Time Warp segment, it seemed to be because you hated the music. So we're going to try something new. First, I'm going to use the 1776 in Context segment where it makes sense. So if a topic has a connection with the American Revolution, or we think there should be a connection with the American Revolution, we'll use that segment. And if it doesn't, we'll use the Time Warp. Only I'll have Daryl Darnell, our podcast engineer, leave the music out of the Time Warp so you don't have to listen to it anymore. So please take a listen, let me know what you think, and we'll run this experiment for a bit and just see how you like it. So thank you again for participating in our survey. I make this podcast for you, so if you ever have feedback for me, please send me an email, liz@benfranklinsworld.com, because I really want you to enjoy the show. Okay, with that, allow me to introduce you to our expert guide. Our guest is an horologist, a clock and watchmaker, and a scholar of horology. He's the founder of Bell Time Clocks, and he has professionally repaired nearly 8,000 timepieces. He's also the author of nearly 150 articles and reviews, and a book, Edward Duffield, Philadelphia Clockmaker, Citizen, and Gentleman, 1730 to 1803. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Bob Frischman.
Great, it's a world I wish I were in reality.
Really? I actually vacillate as to whether I would want to be in Ben Franklin's world in reality or not, because it wasn't a world that was always hospitable to women or people of color.
Yeah, there were hygiene issues too, I guess.
Oh, yeah. And as much as I would like to time travel, because I would like to see the 18th century, I definitely do not want to smell early America.
Good point.
So, Bob, I wonder if we could start our conversation by having you tell us about your love for clocks and watches and how your passion drew you to study the life and work of the 18th century Philadelphia clockmaker, Edward Duffield.
It's a great story, and you almost can feel that the hand of God reached down at certain points and put me in the right direction. Not that I'm a particularly religious guy, but in 1980, just kind of by accident, I met a guy whose basement was full of clock and watch stuff. And almost didn't go to his house, almost didn't go to his basement. But when I was there, something lit up inside me. And I was working on Capitol Hill at that time in politics. So I needed a hobby where you actually could fix something within a finite period. And this was perfect. I had tinkered with old sports cars before, but this was indoor work, no heavy lifting, no oil dripping in my eyes. So I just latched onto it. And I'd say almost since Thanksgiving 1980, no day has gone by when I have not done something with horology. So it was a serious hobby while I still had day jobs. And by the early 90s, I realized this should be my world, my profession. And I hung out the shingle, and this may not mean anything to young people, but I put an ad in the yellow pages and immediately was swamped with work. There aren't many of us in New England where I live is overrun with broken clocks in all these old houses. So immediately was buried in work, and it became a career path that led, as you said, to the 8,000 clocks and counting that I've already sold. People say, gee, this must be tedious. This is not working on Henry Ford's assembly line. This is challenging working on 200, 300-year-old machines that the maker would die laughing if they thought somebody still was using it this far in advance. Nobody's dishwasher is going to be in use 300 years from now. So every clock is challenging in many ways. Even if I've repaired 30 just like it, they're actually not just like it. And they all have this unique 100+ ways of not working even after you fix them. So it's always challenging, but part of it is social too. All these customers, most of them are my friends. I get to go to their house. It's a social call. They're happy to see me because I'm going to fix grandma's clock. So it's been a wonderful thing, kind of socially, professionally, intellectually. And immediately, because I love history, I worked in politics, it spun off into the whole world of horological exploration and where these clocks came from, who invented them, how they were made one by one, and then 1 million by 1 million, in the Chinese factories today where these quartz clocks are made. So I'm just as interested in the history and the culture and the technology as I am in sitting there making an old machine work.
And what is it about Edward Duffield that fascinates you? Because as you were talking, it occurred to me that New England had its own group of early American clockmakers like Seth Thomas and others who were in Boston and Newport and Connecticut. So what about Duffield drew you to research his life and write a book about him?
I was drawn to it by a person who has funded other beautiful, complete clock books. And the authors of those previous books, for example, on the Stretch family, on David Rittenhouse, very competent, nice guys who are friends of mine, when they were approached by this patron and sponsor of these kinds of books, they had just done the last one, Rittenhouse. This fellow came to me, knew that I was also a good writer and a good researcher, and he asked me if I would do a book on Duffield. I was led to him. I have to say, I didn't know that much about Philadelphia history, let alone Philadelphia clockmaking. I'd seen Philadelphia clocks, but very few of them ended up in New England because we have, as you say, our own clockmakers. But this is also during the handcrafted period. So when you get into the early 1800s, suddenly the Industrial Revolution kicked in and nobody made clocks like 18th century clockmakers did, like Simon Willard and Edward Duffield. So suddenly I had an opportunity to dive into Philadelphia history in a way that I wouldn't. I don't live there, hadn't gone there much. So that was just a huge benefit to sort of start from scratch. And maybe it helped me in a way because I had no preconceived notions about Philadelphia or Philadelphia clockmaking. And suddenly, I had to learn everything about it. And maybe because I didn't assume I already knew stuff, I tried to find everything.
Now, before we dive into the specific world of Edward Duffield and his clockmaking, would you tell us about 18th century Philadelphia? What did the city look like by 1750, and just how interested were Philadelphians in keeping time?
Good question. And you sort of hit the nail on the head with the date, because 1751 is when Edward Duffield reached maturity to age 21. He was rich. He could marry right away. He could inhabit one of the homes that he had inherited from his rich grandfather and start a business. And in fact, the first business, he was a grocer. He was selling capers and raisins, but probably already tinkering. But Philadelphia by that time was the second largest city in the whole British world. It was second only to London in population because it was such a favorable location for trade, for agriculture, and because William Penn established it as a highly tolerant community. People didn't arrive there like when they arrived in Boston. If you were a Quaker, you got whipped and sent out of town. But Philadelphia, and they were trying to populate the area. Even right from the beginning, William Penn was advertising this wonderful, verdant new colony in Germany because they wanted people to come and build this community. So by the 1750s, major buildings, Christ Church already up there with the tallest steeple in North America. And it was based, of course, on the Quakers, even though Duffield was not a Quaker. He was first Presbyterian in his family and then Anglican. But the Quakers, had a reputation, deserved, for hard work, for honesty, for frugality, for lack of ostentation. So this city just exploded in population. Shiploads after shiploads of immigrants came, many indentured servants in that period, many from Germany. And the city just blossomed into this international hub, really, of trade. They were exporting a ton of stuff, which meant that they could import luxury goods if you're affluent enough. And one of those substantial luxury goods were clocks and watches. You had a clock in your manor or in your townhouse, and you carried a watch, and your wife carried a watch, perhaps a pin on a chain, and that was part of your life. Timekeeping already for 100 years before that was becoming tyrannical almost in Western civilization. People couldn't eat when they were hungry. They had to eat when the clock said 12 o'clock. They couldn't wake up when the rooster crowed. They had to wake up when the clock rang 6 o'clock or 5 o'clock. So everyone was tuned into what time it was. The most accurate timekeepers were sundials because they aren't wrong, where clocks and watches can easily be wrong. But Duffield also was in charge of the State House clock, which rang the hours, and everybody in the city heard, and they were all on the same page. And you couldn't open the market and sell butter or beef until that bell rang. So the tyranny of timekeeping was there, but of course it was vital for organizing civic life. And the watchman would walk around every night from before 1700 yelling out the time every hour as he walked around the city. Very time conscious, and people wanted timekeepers to keep them so that they weren't late for lunch with their friends.
That's very interesting, because I think when many of us think about Americans' obsession with time and timekeeping, we're thinking about the 19th century with the advent of the Industrial Revolution and the time clock, and then, of course, the railroads. But those things don't come around until 80 or 90 years after 1750. And it sounds like early Americans were just very concerned about timekeeping, and that 18th century Americans in particular were buying sundials and watches and clocks if they could afford them to ensure that they were on time for work and for friends and for family and just keeping time.
I mean, that's a factor of urban life. If you get 10 miles out of Philadelphia, probably most people didn't have a clock or watch and didn't want one. And actually, there's anecdotal evidence where the crusty old farmer there, would laugh at the guy checking his watch because he said, I could look up in the sky and tell you way more accurately what time it is. But certainly for urban life, both American and European, by 1750, it was being ruled because this was commerce and you needed to meet people at the right time, socially and commercially for business reasons. You could get along without a clock or watch, but everybody, I would say, in 1750 knew what time it was, and they needed to know what time it was.
Now, in your book, Edward Duffield, we learn there's not actually a lot of information in the documentary record about Edward Duffield. Even though he was this wealthy white man and their papers tended to be preserved and kept in archives the most, it really doesn't seem like Duffield left behind a lot of personal or family papers, diaries, or account books that we can look to learn a lot more about him. So, Bob, what do we know about Edward Duffield's early life, and what sources were you able to find and use to cobble together these details?
It's frustrating in a way, but I guess almost in a way it was fortuitous for me, because if somebody had discovered, 30 years ago or 20 or 50, Edward Duffield's ledgers or his diary or his trunkload of letters, somebody else would have written this book. I don't think they could have resisted finding this trove of information about an affluent tradesman in 18th century Philadelphia. Fortunately, because he was such a public figure, as was his family, there's public records. There's a lot of tax information, real estate information. So I know that he owned enslaved workers, not many, but servants. I know that he had indentured people that worked for him. I know what taxes he paid. So it was clear how much property he owned, both in the city and out. I know that he was on grand juries, that he tried to be the excise tax collector. That didn't make it. So the voluminous public records, which fortunately people have collated and eventually digitized, led me to Duffield's name in a lot of public places. He was early supporter, a sponsor of the fire insurance company that Franklin initiated, and then he was on that board. So I have those board minutes showing Edward was there every month for those meetings. But one thing we do know, we know when he was born, 1730, even though if you go on the internet, some places still say 1720. But I was able to point to Edward's gravestone, which clearly says when he was born, and usually those aren't mistakes. But I did know that when he was 6 years old, in 10 days in September, his mother and four older brothers died within a 10-day period, probably smallpox. And that had to be formative, but it probably also cemented his relationship with his rich grandfather, because his grandfather did leave him a lot of money, a lot of property, a lot of his estate. So we have that little tidbit, but we really only can extrapolate because of perhaps William Franklin, as we know, Benjamin's first illegitimate son. The Franklins lived right next door at that point to the Duffields, and William Franklin was born 2 months before Edward. And we know that he had private tutoring by Theophilus Grew and other people. So it stands to reason maybe that Edward was there too. It also stands to reason that young teenage Edward hung around with his brother-in-law, Ebenezer Kinnersley, who was Franklin's close collaborator on all those electricity experiments. So maybe Edward was there making stuff out of brass and wood and showing what happens when a lightning bolt hits it. So you can speculate about that. And he rarely placed ads. There's only a handful of newspaper ads. He didn't have to. He was rich. Word of mouth got plenty of business. So, it was frustrating in a way, but it also was challenging and interesting. I was able to pull together enough to say that he was here, he did this, he was there, without knowing anything really about his daily life except what he was wearing, because the Historical Society of Pennsylvania has a ledger of his upscale tailor, Joseph Graysbury, and there's 99 entries over a 10-year period of what Edward Duffield was wearing. So that's kind of cool, and at least you can picture him that way. And you also know that he was extremely active in Christ Church, which was where the Anglicans worshipped. All the city people that were high level and not Quakers worshipped there. And he was a warden and a vestryman, high lay positions in that church. So, you can speculate too that, he had all those connections, all those friends. He is mentioned in the drinker diary. I went and had lunch with Edward Duffield today. So you can picture him sitting around at the London coffee house, and other places with these important people chatting away, and then visiting someone's house to repair their clock or bring them their new clock, or climbing the tower of the State House to work on the clock that he was responsible for. So again, there's those hints, and I'd love to find letters. I mean, we only know of 2 letters that he received. So maybe he wasn't a letter writer. Maybe they all got burnt up, but his family was affluent. You'd think his son, his grandson would have kept those letters. Other people would have kept those letters. So maybe he wasn't a letter writing guy. So I don't have those kinds of things. But we do have a letter to him by Richard Peters, one of the most important people, a minister, saying how much he loved Edward and thanking him for all of his work. We have these hints, but a lot of it is just trying to imagine what he did based on what we knew other people were doing at that time in Philadelphia.
Yeah, that's definitely a practice in history called informed speculation that many historians practice, because we can't know all the details of people's lives. So we try to piece together who they were interacting with. Like you said, through Duffield's membership in Christ Church, we can kind of summarize who he would have been exposed to and whether their records might say something about the person we're looking into. Now, you mentioned that Edward grew up in an upper class, a wealthy household. Would you tell us about Edward's grandfather, who seems to have built and owned all this wealth? How was Benjamin Duffield able to build wealth for his family, and where was he building his wealth? Where did his wealth come from?
It's probably one of those early, almost Horatio Alger stories, but it certainly wasn't unusual for hardworking people that came from England. His grandfather came 4 years before William Penn ever saw Philadelphia. He was one of the first people to arrive. He landed on the shore, came over, and immediately started to buy land. That was what Penn was trying to do, was sell all this land. He had expenses. He needed to sell land, get ground rents and things from people. So Edward's grandfather, Benjamin, came. He eventually brought his own father over. He had married in England, where he came from. There's a village of Duffield near Derby. which is where the family originated. So Benjamin got here. He was a tanner. He started building houses, buying property, had other skills as well. And he just began accumulating property at sort of the sweet spot in early Philadelphia history because, here was all this land available. Here was William Penn and his agents that were dying for hardworking people to build this city almost overnight if they could. So, fortunately, he was a hardworking, smart guy with some resources. And then it just snowballed. Apparently, he held 50 mortgages in the city at the time of his death. Huge property owner, had owned land all over the place and parted with it. So not everybody had those experiences. A lot of people from England and Germany came as indentured servants and took them quite a while to get out of that and then start accumulating wealth. But somehow Benjamin got on it fast. And within 20 years, certainly major landowner. He served in the assembly a couple of terms and continued to build this wealth that he was able to pass on to Edward and other Duffield family members. He had other kids, other wealth went to some of them, but Edward got a pretty big piece of it, including all the silver. So obviously Granddaddy liked young Edward and maybe again felt bad for him because his mother and 4 brothers had all suddenly been struck down when this poor kid was just 6 years old.
I find Duffield's early life and wealth fascinating because he was a tradesperson. And when we look at tradespeople, people who end up in the trades, they usually come from a trades family. For example, Duffield's friend Benjamin Franklin is a really good example of this because Franklin's father, Josiah, had been a silk dyer in England and then a soap and candle maker in Boston. And all of Franklin's brothers had apprenticed to and practiced different trades throughout their lives. And now Edward Duffield, he also had this background. His grandfather had been a tanner who became wealthy through a lot of land and real estate deals. But by Edward's generation, he's the second generation American, Edward didn't need to take up a trade. He had already inherited a lot of money and wealth from his grandfather, so he must have really liked clockmaking to want to pursue it as a business. Which brings us to Lydia's question. How did Edward Duffield come to fall in love with clocks and train to be a clockmaker?
It's a good question because clearly he didn't need to work and he didn't need to work at a trade. But I take a flyer in my book, but I really feel like it's justified because I feel it echoes my own experience. I was raised certainly a middle-class family, pretty well off. I was on that white-collar track. I had day jobs that were white-collar. But man, I sure love to tinker. And I was just drawn to this. So I can picture young Edward, and he probably just wasn't suited to go to school and learn Latin and Hebrew and Greek, which was the classical education then, and decide if he was going to be a landlord or however he was going to just count his money. So I have to feel like it hit him the same way it hit me. And maybe this is presentism is not realistic, but I'm not the only one. At one point, the National Association of Watch and Clock Collectors had more than 40,000 members. And most of those were people that stumbled on this. They didn't go to trade school. They didn't say when they were 14, I'm going to be a clockmaker because my dad was one. Almost every single person I've met who collects clocks, that works on clocks, stumbled on it, came to it accidentally, sometimes later in life. And I'm glad I was only 28 when it hit me. But some guys don't find it till they're 70. And they say, wow, this is actually pretty cool. And actually, I can fix something and look at these great gears. Clockmakers and watchmakers were near the pinnacle of the trade system, way down where the tanners and the candle makers. You had to be quite smart and intelligent and nimble and understand physics and all that stuff to be a clock and a watchmaker. So they were near the top. So it wasn't like Duffield decided he was going to become the janitor at the local jail. He found a prestigious trade and craft that probably, as with me, began as a hobby. And he said, this is pretty cool. And eventually said, I bet I would have even more fun repairing other people's clocks, making clocks, selling clocks to my rich friends. And I've got a leg up because they all know me already. I go to church with these guys. And if they say, hey, Ed is actually a good clockmaker, we see him at church. And, maybe it's a little weird that he puts on an apron, but we love the fact that he does. And that means I don't have to communicate with some lower class person. And that's been my own experience too. I show up at somebody's house on a house call. I'm kind of their peer. I'm kind of an honored guest that somehow has this ability to repair a beautiful, intricate machine. So Until somebody tells me I'm really full of it, I'm going to say that Duffield probably had the same attraction to it that I've had, and that's why he ended up doing it. And that's also why he ended up not doing it after 1775 when things got tough, with England, and he had a lot of competitors, and he had this estate, Benfield, waiting 10 miles out of town that he could live on. So at that point, he said, why do I need to keep doing this? Same way Franklin retired from getting his hands all inky in his 40s. Then Duffield in his 40s says, I'm going to move out to Benfield. Things aren't looking too good with Britain and all. And I don't want to fix clocks or make clocks anymore. And I believe that's what he did. And, I've sort of gotten away from the bench myself for similar reasons. One thing is that it's hard. It's a lot easier to sit here talking about clockmaking than it is to fix a 300-year-old clock.
It also sounds like Edward's wealth would have enabled him to work as a clockmaker, because wealth would have given him the ability to tinker. He wouldn't have had to pay for his own time, so he could have tinkered and learned how to work with clocks, and he would have been able to purchase clocks and their parts in order to tinker with them. So I do wonder if you would tell us more about the financial investment that someone like Edward Duffield, an aspiring clockmaker, would have needed to make in order to buy a clock in the mid-18th century in a city like Philadelphia, and how Edward may have gone about the work of tinkering and learning how to repair clocks.
And that's a good point because it's controversial in a way, too, because the museum, sort of the decorative arts people and the ones who admire, collect, assess Philadelphia furniture like to think that the clockmaker was in that same kind of mode where he was melting down Aunt Mabel's candlestick, getting the brass and making a clock out of lumps of brass and steel. Truly, the furniture makers were doing that. They were taking logs and planks and making furniture. But for 100 years, that was not the way clocks were made anymore, except way out, maybe in the rural areas. Edward and every other American clockmaker was either getting rough cast parts from local braziers or metal workers, or more likely importing them from England. You have to remember, England was not keen on us making anything. They wanted us to buy products from them in exchange for our tobacco and wheat and corn and all that stuff. So it was difficult if Edward wanted to fabricate stuff from scratch, and there was no reason for him to do that. He was able, right down the street, right off the boat from England, to buy clock parts, again, rough parts, clock movements, dials, faces, all those things. So he was working as a modern clockmaker almost in the same type of globalization system we have now. He was importing finished or semi-finished goods, finishing the assembly and putting his name on them and selling them. So he probably knew how to make clocks from scratch. He sort of had to know that. But I don't think he did it because it would have taken him way longer than buying the parts that he then finished. He was in business. He wasn't interested in making an antique. He was interested in making a clock somebody would buy. And you have to remember, too, that the snobby people, the people that had money in Philadelphia, as in most of North America, if they had money, they wanted English stuff. So they weren't interested in Edward producing some locally made clock that didn't look any good or look different than what their neighbor had that just came off the boat from England. Edward had to make clocks with significant amount of English content or ones that looked just like English clocks, or he wasn't going to sell them. It's no denigration of his skills. There's nothing easy about taking rough parts and turning it into a machine that keeps time within 60 seconds a week. It's not easy, and you have to know how to do it. But that's a reality of clockmaking, and it somehow doesn't jibe with clock collectors of early clocks because they want to imagine Edward sitting there with the flickering candle, his buck knife, making a clock. And that just hadn't happened for a century before that. And watchmaking was even worse. Almost nobody could sit down and make those tiny parts by themselves. It was already a specialized division of labor. There would be 30 different people providing the parts for watches at that time. Everybody calls them watchmakers. They still call them watchmakers today, but watchmakers, 99.9% of them don't make watches. They service them and they sell them. And that's exactly what Edward, too. I'm sure he put his name on English watches, but he was not making something the size of a fly leg in his workshop. He was buying watches.
Now, Jim would like to know whether everyday people in mid-18th century Philadelphia and elsewhere in early America were able to afford a timepiece, or whether clocks and watches were items owned just by the wealthy. And it sounds like if you were wealthy, what you really wanted was an English-made clock. So did this mean that Edward and his fellow American-based clockmakers built and sold clocks and watches to more middle-class early Americans, since the wealthy were directly importing clocks from England?
They certainly were expensive. There were diarists who exaggeratingly said everybody with nice clothes on in Philadelphia, even in 1740s, was carrying a watch. Certainly that wasn't true, and estate inventories verified that it wasn't true. They were expensive. You needed to be pretty affluent merchant or landowner to own a clock. I'd say at that time a tall case clock. There is one ledger that the Historical Society of Pennsylvania has by a contemporary clockmaker of Edward. And in that, he's selling clocks for maybe 10 pounds or so. That could be maybe a year's wages for a regular person in the city. Clocks and watches were not everyday things for anybody in the world until mass production began in the first quarter of the 19th century. So it was really only people with means who could afford them or wanted to afford them, because you have to remember, too, that you didn't buy and forget. These things, because of the dust, the vibrations of horseback riding and wagons, these needed frequent service. In my own town in Andover, 60 years ago, there were 3 watchmakers working full time, keeping everybody's ticking watch and clock going. So Edward's main business was watch repair. And if you carried a pocket watch, the odds are you went to Edward every year or every 2 years because it needed to be cleaned, or you dropped it, or the glass crystal broke. There were the ongoing costs, not just the purchase costs. So you needed money. And that's why a lot of watches were stolen, too. They were sort of the perfect pickpocket item or burglar item because they were fungible, that this was something small and valuable. Watchmakers' shops got broken into all the time, inventory stolen. So it was a very common thing to have stolen, too, because it was so small and valuable. And odds are, if a rich guy was walking down the street at night near you, he had a watch in his pocket. And if he was a good target to knock on the head to take his watch, he did it.
So we've established that if you're really wealthy, what you do is you directly import a timepiece from England. And yet, in your book, Edward Duffield, which is this really nice coffee table-sized book that includes a lot of wonderful photographs, in your book, you have several pictures of clocks that Edward Duffield signed his name to and made. Was there a market for domestic-made clocks, or were these clocks simply projects that Edward Duffield built because he had the money and wanted to see if he could actually build a clock and not just repair one?
The market absolutely was bespoke only. Somebody would come to Edward and say, I want you to provide me with a tall case clock. They were not called grandfather clocks until 1876 and afterwards. And basically, they were just called the clock. I want a clock, or an 8-day clock, meaning a weekly wind clock, not a cheap clock you had to wind every day, even at that time. So they would come to Edward and he would say, fine. And he would source the dial, the face that he would then engrave his name on. He would source either a complete movement from England, or he would source the parts from England, or some of the parts. He might cast the movement plates, which were pretty flat pieces, but he might get the rough gears and all those wheels, because otherwise it would take him forever to make them. So he was a merchant. He was selling clocks, and he was selling basically English clocks. And his customers, perhaps his customers themselves didn't go to England. His customers would order them through another dealer, a local merchant such as John Wood, who regularly advertised he was importing clocks and watches from England. A lot of them through his Quaker network. Wagstaff was a major maker and supplier from London, and there's a ton of Wagstaff clocks and watches in Pennsylvania because of that. So people were not buying Edward Duffield clocks that somehow were this American cheap brand. They cost just as much as a Wagstaff clock. They were basically English. They looked English, but they had Edward's name on them. But the key thing, most people were buying clocks for the furniture, which Edward had nothing to do with. He was not a cabinet maker or woodworker. People would order the clock, which was the face and the movement, from him, and go down the street and order the case from Jonathan Gosselow or other cabinet makers of that time, and they would deal with them about how fancy this case was. Did it have quarter columns? Did it have carved finials? All kinds of things. So again, when people go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and look at an Edward Duffield clock, there's nothing Edward Duffield about that clock except the face and the movement behind it. All that furniture had nothing to do with Edward. He was probably involved in them deciding who to go to or what it would be like. but people were buying furniture that happened to have a machine inside.
I'm glad you brought up the furniture around a clock because Susan has a question about how the cabinets around a clock were made. But first, let's take a quick moment for our episode sponsor. There is always a lot going on at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. With so much to see, do, and experience in Colonial Williamsburg, like special events, new programming, new museum exhibits, archaeology digs, and building restorations, your best way to get to know the foundation and stay on top of its happenings is to join its mailing lists, which you can do at benfranklinsworld.com/CW subscribe. At benfranklinsworld.com/CW subscribe, you can sign up for one or more of Colonial Williamsburg's mailing lists. There are mailing lists for seasonal updates, events, and special offers, the art museums of Colonial Williamsburg, the Colonial Williamsburg Teacher Institute, the Power of Place, which is a list all about how you can support the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation and its work. And there's even a mailing list for shopping and special deals in Colonial Williamsburg shops. Once you sign up for one or more of Colonial Williamsburg's mailing lists, the foundation will send you insider information about your favorite parts of Colonial Williamsburg. To sign up for a mailing list, visit benfranklinsworld.com/CW subscribe. That's benfranklinsworld.com/CW subscribe. Bob, Susan would like to know if someone like Edward Duffield and these other prominent clockmakers in Philadelphia, if they needed a case to go around a clock they had made, would they have worked with a cabinet maker they knew? Or would they have gone out and searched for a cabinet maker who specialized in making clock cabinets? So how did this relationship between clockmaker and woodworker work?
The designs were sort of standard and distinctive. So the Chippendale book came in the mid-1760s, so that suddenly, that kind of design features happened. Before that. They were Queen Anne styles and all that. So the people who bought clocks wanted them to look like the clocks that their neighbor had. So they were standard designs pretty much. And again, it just was sort of based on how much you wanted to pay for the ornamentation of it and the embellishments. And as we know, the Quakers weren't really into public ostentation. So some of the clocks, the cases that Edwards clocks are in, are not that fancy because they probably were made and sold for Quakers. But others, for Anglicans, big 10-footers with all kinds of carving and scroll work and flame finials and things like that. So those would be there. But the clock case designs were pretty much standard and just varied as far as the ornamentation and embellishment would go. And again, that was totally up to the buyer of the case after they had communicated with Edward about what he wanted to look like. I'm sure Edward was maybe steering people to Jonathan Gosselow because Jonathan Gosselow married Edward's cousin. So that could have happened. And there are other records, a few, where Duffield is working with other Philadelphia cabinet makers as well. It was a small community of the people at the top because you're at the pointy end of the pyramid. So he was selling 2, 3, 4 clocks a year. He wasn't IKEA. These were people that had the money. They said, I want this clock. Maybe I won't import it from Wagstaff because Edward's going to make me a clock that's just as good and looks just like a Wagstaff clock. And I'm going to put it in this drop-dead mahogany case that's got all this carving on it. So I think that's how things were done.
Now, as we're talking about the business side of clockmaking in the 18th century, Beth is curious if Duffield and other clockmakers ran their shops as family businesses. We know that Benjamin Franklin ran his print shop this way. Deborah Reed Franklin, of course, kept all the accounts for the shop and helped out with customers. Did this type of family help in keeping a shop going work for clockmakers and clockmaking as well? And if so, would we have seen women unofficially learn how to make and repair clocks and watches to help out in the shop?
There certainly are examples of women, usually the widows, who have taken over when the husband dies and they've either learned it or they learn it or they then manage the business with journeymen and apprentices. That early, there are very few women who actually trained outside of the family, and even within the family, very few of them wanted to or were allowed to, but there are some examples. And you're right to mention Deborah Reed, who was Franklin's helpmeet through his early lives there. Edward married into money as well. So I don't think his wife was going to put the apron on and stand there in the shop. And Edward's sons did not go into it. One was a bachelor, lived his whole life out at Benfield and was kind of a patron of the arts. The other son became a physician and was a widely respected physician that worked right through the yellow fever epidemics when a lot of people left town. So well respected for that. So in this case, there's only one indication that Edward even had an apprentice or a journeyman, because there's a guy who advertised that said he was from Edward's shop when he set up his own. But we don't know if, again, journeyman or apprentice, we don't know. So Edward had a shop, probably nicely laid out, nice stuff, because he could afford it. And he sat there and he did his clockwork, and he had servants that probably helped him. We know at least he had one guy working in the shop there with him. But this was not the kind of family business, because we know his daughters were in high society too. So I think this is something Dad did until 1775, when he didn't do it anymore. There are insurance surveys of his home. They don't indicate a shop area, but I looked at other clockmaker surveys and they don't say there was a shop there either, even though clearly that was the model, that the front first floor room was the workshop, but not very big, 10 by 12 maybe. So I think Edward was in there. He was doing his clockwork, and his sons were not in there with him. That seems pretty clear.
You mentioned earlier in our conversation that Edward was the keeper of the State House clock, which was the original clock inside what is today Independence Hall. And when we read your book, Edward Duffield, we get the idea that this was a fairly prestigious position. So would you tell us about the State House clock and how Edward Duffield came to be its keeper?
Yeah, this is a big old machine, and it's kind of a stressful position, because if it stops working, everybody in the city knows who to blame. So we got paid 20 pounds a year and sometimes more, because he probably had to do additional repairs. So this was a big old cast iron frame machine that had long shafts that stretched out to the edges of the building. It wasn't in a tower, because there was no tower yet. That came later. So this was mounted in the center of the building, and these shafts that could have been 30, 40 feet long ran the dials at each end of the building. So a lot of opportunities for friction, a lot of temperature, weather issues too. So this was tricky work. The clock was made by the son of Peter Stretch, who was an earlier famous Philadelphia clockmaker. His son Thomas, in that case, it was a family business. Thomas Stretch became an apprentice and then carried on Peter Stretch's business. So anyway, Thomas Stretch made this movement. He maintained it until the 1750s, and then probably didn't want to anymore. So Edward was appointed by the Assembly as the guy who took over. And in fact, David Rittenhouse, an even more famous clockmaker in Philadelphia, took over from Edward when Edward left town. So this was stressful, and no doubt he was up there a lot. You know, he only lived 3 blocks away. So if he's lying there at 3 a.m. and the clock strikes 2, he better get up there and see what the problem is, because the whole city would be mad at him pretty soon otherwise. So there was a lot to these machines were temperamental. They weren't that accurate. So he was probably always checking his sundial, putting the right time on his pocket watch, and then walking over there and resetting the time if it needed to be reset. So again, he took care of that clock. It's a sad story, because that clock movement eventually was supplanted by a clock by Isaiah Lukens, who was a later famous Philadelphia clockmaker. The original stretch movement ended up in the steeple of a nearby Catholic church. An anti-Catholic mob burned that church to the ground. And people say the last time that the stretch clock struck was 10 o'clock, and then everything had burned to the ground. So we don't know what that movement looked like, but I do show a movement that was in a church steeple in Newburyport, Massachusetts, right near me, that no doubt looked a lot like the stretch movement that Edward was caring for those 12 years.
We think of doctors being on call and lawyers, but we likely never imagined a clockmaker being on call. But it sounds like, as a tower clock keeper, Edward had a somewhat stressful job and definitely was on call every time that time needed to be adjusted or the city's clock had to be fixed, because people really relied on it.
And I am too. You know, when people's clock that they got as their wedding present or anniversary present stops ticking, they're kind of panicky when they call me. They don't hear those chimes. They can't sleep at night because they don't hear those chimes. So it's a phenomenon today as well.
So as we've teased throughout our conversation, an important relationship in Edward Duffield's life was his friendship with Benjamin Franklin and the Franklin family. And John wonders if he would tell us about Duffield's relationship with Franklin and how Edward Duffield became known as Benjamin Franklin's clockmaker.
Right, and that's wrong, as I point out in my book. I mean, it goes back to 7 years before Edward Duffield was born, because that's when Benjamin Franklin ended up walking by Deborah Reed's house, seeing her laughing at him when he's carrying those loaves of bread. And then he returned and became a boarder there. So his house, the wall of Deborah Reed and John Reed's house, is the same wall that the Duffield family lived in. So they were next door neighbors before Edward was even born. Later in life, Franklin rented houses that were within the estate of Benjamin Duffield. So all you can picture is that Franklin was 24 years older than Edward. So these weren't peers, but his son was a peer of Edward's. So there they are living right next door to each other. Clearly, Edward is starting to get interested in mechanical stuff. There was Franklin, who was interested in all kinds of intellectual pursuits. There's Edward, who maybe wasn't that interested in book learning, but maybe had a proficiency. There's Edward's brother-in-law, Ebenezer Kinnersley, and they're making instruments for their electrical experiments. So I think probably even as a teenager, Duffield was in Franklin's house and spending time with them. Also, as the Franklins, as we know, ran a post office. And the American Philosophical Society, the publisher of my book, recently digitized all those post office records. And there's 9 entries for young Edward going into the post office to get letters from New York and Boston. So that's kind of a cool scene to think of Edward walking in there and saying, hey, Deborah, can I get my letter from Boston? And then the families, I think, are the key to this, because especially during the Revolutionary War and even before that, when things got bad in the city, maybe health-wise, people still getting smallpox, still getting yellow fever, all these horrible throat distemper, probably diphtheria. City people wanted to get out of town. And there was Edward's lovely estate, Benfield, 10 miles north of the city. Sally Franklin went there with her kids. There's a lot of letters back and forth saying that I think our daughter loves the Duffields as much as she loves us. So that's there. And Edward's mother-in-law, Mary Parry Smith, the mother of Edward's wife, was Deborah Franklin's closest friend. 50 years they were close friends. So clearly there was maybe not Thanksgiving yet, but clearly there were all these dinner tables when these people clearly were around the same table talking. But there's no records that Franklin ever bought a clock from Duffield, but maybe Duffield gave him clocks, because there's Duffield clocks in the Franklin family that are claimed to have descended from Benjamin. We don't know that for sure. But we also know that when Franklin all those years was in England, he did not have clocks made by Edward. And even when Deborah wrote from Philadelphia, there's something wrong with the clock, Franklin doesn't immediately reply and says, well, how come Eddie isn't fixing it? There's no mention of that. Deborah sent watches to Benjamin in London for him to get repaired in London. So why didn't she walk him around the corner to Edward? And also, Franklin visited many times with one of England's most prominent clockmakers, John Whitehurst. And there are Franklin-owned, Franklin-designed clocks with John Whitehurst's name on the dial. So those connections are documented, and clearly there's letters between Whitehurst and Franklin like crazy. There's no letters between Franklin and Duffield about anything, and certainly not about clockmaking or horology. We do know Franklin sent the book that John Harrison had to produce when he was trying to get the longitude prize. He had to describe how he created a marine chronometer that was accurate enough. And Franklin sent that book to Edward, but he sent it to Deborah to give to Edward. And then Edward thanked Franklin by telling Deborah to thank Franklin. So those connections are dubious, and I'm sure these guys talked about clocks when they were sitting around, but that claim that he was Franklin's clockmaker simply can't be justified, as much as I'd like it to be.
Well, this certainly has us wondering about the dynamics of their relationship for sure. And of course, we shouldn't really read too much into the fact that there aren't extant letters between Duffield and Franklin, because if you think about John and Abigail Adams, they only wrote letters to each other when they were separated, which was often a lot of the time. If Franklin and Duffield were sitting around each other's tables, they would have just talked to each other. They wouldn't have needed to write letters.
And of course, the most important conversation that he was part of was when the draft of the Declaration of Independence was discussed at Benfield in Duffield's living room, because Franklin was staying with him in June of 1776. And Adams and Jefferson had to go out there to see Franklin, and that's where the first draft of the Declaration of Independence was discussed and edited. And I don't think Duffield was waiting in the kitchen. I think he was right there listening, chiming in, pouring the Madeira, and part of that conversation. So that's a great thing to imagine those men in the same room. And I'm glad I kind of stumbled on that. It wasn't a well-known thing. In some obscure reference, I found that had actually happened out there at Benfield. And there's letters from Franklin to other people, like to Benjamin Rush, the doctor, saying, I'm writing you this letter from the Manor of Moorland, Benfield, where I'm staying with my friend Eddie. So those family connections are wonderful to think about. I wish we had letters. As we know, a ton of Franklin letters were used as sleeve patterns and were handed out and lost. So maybe that stack were made into sleeve patterns, and that's why we don't have them. We do know there was a letter from young Benjamin, Edward's son, to Franklin when young Benjamin was in France and having money problems. And he did allude to his father's kind of inflexibility because he had sounded like dad cut him off because he had been profligate or something. So there's one little hint that maybe the father-son thing wasn't too good there. And there's the son asking Ben Franklin for a little money so he could get back home to Pennsylvania. So that's just one little tiny window into maybe Edward's character. Maybe he was a little rigid or over disciplinary with that oldest son. We can't know that, although there isn't a lot of strong father-son indications between those two. So maybe an indication that he was a tough father in some ways and maybe not as educated as his son would have liked. And maybe that was part of the problem.
Bob, why do you think investigating the work and lives of clockmakers like Edward Duffield is important? How do you think the lives and work of early American clockmakers can help us better understand the world of early America?
There's the big picture that I alluded to of how important timekeeping was. Already life was being organized. So if you have clocks, you need clockmakers. So that's part of the story. And of course, the public clocks. In Boston and Philadelphia, there were things ringing bells 50 years before Edward started working. So for sure, to get an understanding of life in colonial America, you can't ignore the fact that there were bells ringing and clock faces telling people what time it was, and that this was helping to organize their lives. There were certainly already, well, even 300 years early, all this metaphorical stuff, particularly in areas that were more religious like New England, where everybody understood that the clock was a metaphor for mortality and how you needed to organize your life in this world so that you would be in the right place in the next world. Sometimes God was called the great clockmaker, or that the clock was a metaphor for the universe, where God created the universe and started the pendulum swinging the same way that a clockmaker starts these things going. So I think there was almost a spiritual component to clockmaking because of that metaphor, and also because I think anybody who's lived with an old ticking clock gets the sense that this thing is alive almost. This is a heartbeat. Most clocks, these big clocks, they tick seconds. They tick 60 times a minute, which is almost the same rate as the pulse when you were inside your mother's womb. Maybe there's connections that way too that we don't even think about. It was the only machine in most people's houses. You know, they didn't have vacuum cleaners or ninja blenders. If they had a machine in their house, it was the clock. That was it. So this was special. And there was the notion that this was animated somehow, that this thing ticked, it talked, it had hands, it had faces. You know, those words aren't by accident. This clock was looking at you the same way that you were looking at it. I'm waxing a little philosophical here, but I think nobody ignored these kinds of significances for timepieces at that period as well. Certainly respected trade. Towns had trouble getting clockmakers. Towns had to save up a lot of money to finally get a clock in the steeple of their church. I just looked at 400 pictures of 19th century Connecticut churches, congregational churches. Only about 12% of them had clocks in the steeples because the town couldn't afford them, couldn't afford to put a clock in there. That was symbolic, too, of your town having arrived, affluent and sophisticated enough to have that. And if you owned a clock in your own house, immediately that signaled to everybody else that you were rich enough, sophisticated enough, technologically aware enough to have this one machine in your house that often was the most valuable thing you owned, except maybe the bed linens and, of course, the house. But often second in valuation in estates was the clock. And that's why there's so many of them left, because they can't throw out grandma's clock. So unless the house burnt down, these clocks got passed along and were cherished things. You don't have grandma's tennis shoes, but you have her clock. It was a cherished thing because grandma looked at it 100 times a day. This clock looked back at grandma 100 times a day. So huge associations between clocks. Whenever you see old paintings and there's a clock in the corner, boom, right away you know this family was the right kind of family to own a clock like this. So obviously I've thought about this a long time and about why everybody should love old clocks and what they mean.
Well, now it's time for our new segment, 1776 in Context. As we're in the midst of the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, Bob, what do you think your research into Edward Duffield and clockmaking in early Philadelphia can teach us about the American Revolution?
Well, certainly the revolution was hugely disruptive to Philadelphia. So if you're talking about Philadelphia history during the American Revolution, the city was occupied. British general thought if he occupied the hub of the revolution, that was going to be it. But the Congress just moved out of town and they sat in the city for 7 months until they ran out of food and stuff to steal, and then they left. So that's a huge part of Philadelphia's history, is the fact that they were occupied, but then they were the government center of the colonial rebellion until 1783, and then it went on to become the capital, really, until Washington, D.C. was built. But the revolution, Edward evaded military service. There was a system then, as many other places, where you could essentially buy a substitute. You paid a fine, and if you did, you didn't have to serve in the militia. And we have those records that Edward paid 10 pounds and then 40 pounds, and he didn't have to serve in the militia. He was safe out in his place, although he was captured. When the British held Philadelphia, they would foray out of the city. So all these dragoons on horseback went out into Edward's neighborhood and captured him. And he ended up being jailed for a short time in the Philadelphia jail that he had helped build. He designed it and helped build it. And suddenly he's a prisoner there, but he got out. And that was a huge thing where loyalists stayed, but a lot of people fled. So who stayed? And then what happened to them afterwards? So if the loyalists stayed, the British left. Like 3,000 loyalists left with the British troops because they knew that life wasn't going to be good for them. But others stayed, and life was not good for them once it was reoccupied by the Patriots. So there's a lot of intense history. Duffield originally in 1774 was on one of those committees of mechanics. How are we going to respond to the closing of the port of Boston and the Boston Tea Party? So Edward was on that first committee when they were supposed to come up with recommendations, but he never comes up again. And I think it's because of all the import arguments and restrictions where a lot of people were saying, how about non-importation? This was going on since the Stamp Act. We don't want to bring in British goods. But Edward was kind of stuck because he was bringing in British goods, clock faces, clock movements. So was he really going to be on board, as a lot of other merchants were not too, who relied on British goods to have a business? So he was probably conflicted. And maybe that's again why he said, before things really get ugly, I better move out of town and not continue. So it's not as vivid as my next book is about the Mulliken family of Massachusetts clockmakers. And Nathaniel Mulliken, his clock shop was on the Green at Lexington. He was a witness. He was one of the people that did depositions about what happened at Lexington Green, and his shop was burned down by the British. So he had a little more direct interaction with the American Revolution than Edward Duffield did. But clearly Philadelphia was perhaps the most important location for anybody to be who was a witness to the American Revolution.
Well, you've just given us a preview of your new book, but is there something more about it that you'd like us to know about?
Yes, of course, because I have a co-author, a great friend of mine, and we've already located 3 Mulliken account books. So we have an overload of primary material, even down to the rent he was paying. When one of the Mullikens was building his house, we saw him buying the bricks. One of these account books, there's 700 entries of watch repairs. He was in Salem, Massachusetts. So in 1793, 97, we know exactly all the English watches that these people were carrying and wearing. And this wonderful Samuel Mulliken, he not only recorded the customer's name, he recorded the English watchmaker's name who made it and the serial number. So that's all going to be a database in the book where somebody who owns a watch by some London watchmaker may find out that it was being carried in Salem, Massachusetts in 1796. And of course, there's more of them. I documented 71 Duffield things. I already have documented 216 Mulliken clocks that are out there. There are obviously more. There were several members of that family, generations that produced clocks, signed clocks. So it's a wonderful thing, and it's got to be a bigger book. But the American Philosophical Society says they are interested in co-publishing it with the Concord Museum in Concord, Massachusetts. So 4 years from now, probably, maybe 3 if we're lucky, please have me back.
And where is the best place to reach you if we have more questions about Edward Duffield or clockmaking in early America?
The website I established, when websites first started existing for my clock business, is Belltime. So it's bell-time.com. And also, when I first began this research 5 years ago on Duffield, I created a Duffield website, which is simply edwardduffield.com. And, other interviews, talks of mine are there too. And both of those places have my email where everybody is welcome to contact me.
Bob Frischman, thank you for introducing us to the life and work of Ben Franklin's neighbor and friend, Edward Duffield.
Thank you for having me. This has been great.
Keeping time in early America was a part of everyday life. If you lived on a farm or in the countryside, chances are you kept the time by a sundial you kept in your yard, or you simply looked up and used your experience watching the sun traverse the sky. If you were an urban dweller, someone who lived in one of British America's busy port cities, then you typically kept the time with a sundial in your house's yard, or by looking up at the city's clock and listening for its bells to chime. Only the wealthy in early America could afford a watch or a clock, which helped make clockmaking one of the trades at the top of the skilled tradesman's hierarchy. As a clockmaker, men and women like Edward Duffield interacted with men and women of means. They also worked with manufactured parts and pieces, so their work was skilled, but often less physical and dirty than, say, making tools in a blacksmith shop, running a printing press in a print shop, or carving and working with wood in a cabinet maker's shop. So the life and work of a clockmaker like Edward Duffield can reveal to us what life was like to be a tradesperson who interacted with the wealthy, what it was like to run a family business from your home, and how early Americans were connected to time and the chiming of the clock. Of course, Edward Duffield wasn't your average clockmaker. He was a wealthy man who worked because he enjoyed it rather than because he had to survive and support his family. As a wealthy man and a pillar of Philadelphia society because of his wealth, Duffield was a man who interacted with men like Benjamin Franklin, men who served the city, colony, and the new United States in important government positions. So Edward Duffield's life not only reveals to us what it was like to be an early American going about life in a world that was conscious of timekeeping, his life also reveals to us what it was like to live and work near men like Benjamin Franklin, what it was like to witness and experience the American Revolution as someone who was more than a bystander to events like the Declaration of Independence and its drafting. With Edward Duffield's life and work, we not only get a glimpse of everyday life in early America, we also get a glimpse of what life looked like for wealthy men and women and their families who experienced the American Revolution without playing a prominent role in the event. You'll find more information about Bob, his book, Edward Duffield, plus notes, links, and a transcript for everything we talked about today on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/402. If you know someone who would love this episode, please share it with them. I could really use your help growing the audience for this show, so please be a good friend. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. Production assistance for this podcast comes from Morgan McCullough. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, what did you think of our new segment? Did you enjoy it? Do you think it needs a musical segue? Please let me know. Liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios.